All right, today we're diving into a source text that lays out a detailed, point-by-point rebuttal to some common justifications for the marriage of the Prophet Muhammad to Aisha. We're going to look at the historical and scriptural arguments it brings up. So, here's how we're going to break this down. The source has a really clear structure. We'll start with the question that really kicks this whole thing off. Then, we'll walk through how the text tries to dismantle the justifications, looking at what it calls contradictions and specific evidence from Islamic texts. Let's get into it. So, where does this all begin? Well, the entire rebuttal is built around one specific question that was posed to Dr. Jonathan A. C. Brown, a well-known professor and Muslim apologist at Georgetown. And here's that question. A user asks Dr. Brown how to square these two kind of conflicting ideas. On one hand, you have Muhammad as a role model for all people for all time. On the other hand, you have his marriage to a very young Aisha, an act that, let's be frank, is considered a serious crime by modern standards. The question is pretty simple. How can both of those things be true at the same time? Okay, so Dr. Brown's answer really sets the stage for everything the source text is about to argue against. He makes three main points. First, he says the marriage was totally normal for that time and culture. Second, the proof is that there's no record of anyone criticizing it. And third, he argues that not everything the Prophet did is meant to be a strict blueprint for all Muslims today. The source text decides to kick off its rebuttal by going after Dr. Brown's second point first, this idea that no recorded criticism means it was universally accepted. And this is where the source brings up a classic concept from logic. It calls this an argument from silence, which is a logical fallacy. The basic idea is, you can't really prove something happened, or in this case that nothing happened, just because there's no evidence. Just because no records of complaints survived doesn't automatically mean nobody ever complained. And right here, the source sums it up perfectly. It argues that history is often written by the victors, or at least by those whose records managed to survive the centuries. So a lack of a written complaint isn't proof of agreement. It's just proof that no written complaint was saved. All right, so after tackling the logic, the source moves on. It dives right into the Islamic texts themselves to point out what it calls a direct contradiction. First, the source just lays out the basic facts of the marriage, pulling from a hadith in Sahih Muslim. It states, Muhammad was 54 and Aisha was 9. And it makes a point to add that, according to the records, she was still playing with dolls at the time. But then, and this is a huge but for the source test, it presents this really powerful counterexample. It points to a hadith where Muhammad's own daughter, Fatima, gets marriage proposals from his closest friends. And what was his response? He said she was too young. Now, the source notes that estimates put Fatima's age somewhere between 9 and 19 at the time. And when you put those two situations side by side, the source argues the contrast is just stark. It really forces the question, why was a 9-year-old Aisha considered old enough for a 54-year-old Muhammad, but his own daughter was called too young for men who were actually younger than him? So the source is really laying down a challenge here. It uses this comparison to suggest there might have been a double standard. One set of rules for himself and a different set for everyone else. From Muhammad's own actions, the rebuttal then zooms in on the Quran itself, arguing that the scripture actually provides a textual basis for marrying girls who haven't even reached puberty yet. The source points us directly to this verse, Quran 65:4. It's all about the iddah, which is the mandatory waiting period for a woman after a divorce. Yeah, this waiting period is a standard part of Islamic law. But the part the source really latches onto is that this verse specifically sets out a 3-month waiting period not only for women who are past menopause, but also for girls who do not have their monthly courses yet. And to back this up, they bring in a real heavy hitter. The source cites the commentary of Ibn Kathir, a hugely respected classical scholar, whose interpretation of this verse explicitly says it includes the young who have not reached the years of menstruation. Okay, so let's keep going, because the source then circles back to another point Dr. Brown made in his original defense, the limit on how many wives a man can have. And here we see another one of these side-by-side comparisons. On one side, you have the Quranic verse that clearly limits Muslim men to 4 wives. And on the other, a hadith stating that when Muhammad died, he had 9 wives. Another apparent contradiction. But here's the thing. The source points out that this wasn't some kind of oversight. In fact, it notes that the Quran itself, right here in verse 3350, directly addresses this, calling it a privilege for you only, not for the rest of the believers. And this all builds to the final and, maybe the most provocative piece of evidence the source presents. It's testimony from one of the most central figures in this whole discussion,
Aisha herself.
This first quote comes from a Sahih hadith, and it's presented as Aisha's own perspective. It seems to show her initial feelings about the whole situation, a kind of disapproval for women who would just offer themselves directly to Muhammad.
And that leads to what the source presents as the absolute climax of its argument. After a Quranic verse came down that gave Muhammad special flexibility in his marital arrangements, Aisha is reported to have made this really pointed comment. The source presents this as her own observation that God's revelations seem to line up very, very conveniently with Muhammad's personal wishes.
And that's where the source leaves us, with this final, really challenging question. Based on all the evidence it's laid out, it asks you to consider, do these accounts paint a picture of a prophet being guided by divine mercy, or a man whose God seemed to rush to fulfill his every desire? It's a pretty provocative way to end a very detailed rebuttal.